So, the exam next week is on the leg. Okay, you should have the handout. If you don't have the handout, I will give you copies of the handout. It's on the leg muscles, it is on the spinal cord, it is on the neuron, it is on that model there of the microscopic muscle model, it is on the eye, the ear, and the brain. Okay, and basically I think we've covered everything but the brain and the eye and the ear. So we will do that today. So this is the brain, obviously, and we have the clear skull model here that sort of shows all the structures in here that are obviously important, and you probably went over in lecture, like the cranial nerves and things like that. Okay, and this structure here, this pink structure, is the pituitary gland. So when you remove the brain from the skull, you always have to be careful. Okay, usually what happens is the pituitary gland remains sort of in the skull itself, sitting in the soleotarsic or the sphenoid bone, which by now you should know that. Okay, and basically that's exactly what happened here. That pink structure here is the pituitary gland. You can even see the little stalk that attaches it, as we'll see, to the hypothalamus. So the cranial nerves, basically, some of them you have already seen and you know. I'm going to, I think on the handout there's a couple of them there that you're responsible for. So this here, on the brain itself, is cranial nerve 2, or really the olfactory tract and bulb. Basically the nerve fibers come through the cribriform plate in the ethmoid bone, okay, and come up, and then they form the olfactory tract and bulb, okay, and then the information is sent to the appropriate parts of the brain, okay, for smell, for olfaction. Cranial nerve 2 is basically the optic nerve, these guys over here, for vision. Okay, and they're going to come out from the posterior portion of the eye through the optic canal in the sphenoid bone, or optic foramen. Okay, and the thing about vision is that you have peripheral vision and you have more central vision. So what happens is that in order for the brain to get a complete picture of what we're looking at, the information crosses at this X here, which is referred to as the optic chiasm. Okay, the optic chiasm. Okay, and so by the time the information gets to the posterior point in the brain where it's processed, okay, basically, remember, the eye is like a camera, so it produces a negative. Okay, and then it's responsibility of the brain to turn it upside, back, right side up, and a positive. Okay, and what the occipital lobe does, because of the optic chiasm here and the crossing from all parts of both eyes, it gets a complete picture of what we're looking at, and then that's what we're seeing. So you have the olfactory nerves and tracts and bulbs. You have the optics and the optic chiasm. Okay, and then in here you can see, here's your optic nerves in here, coming through the optic foramen. Okay, now all the others you can sort of see. When you take a look at this, I'm not going to ask you to name abducens or trochlea or oculomotor or any of those. They're numbered anyway. So it tells you the number and it tells you the nerve. Okay? So it's already in here. But all of them come out through the midbrain, through the pons they originate from, or somewhere in the brain stem. Okay? And you can see them, a lot of them even more forward, like the olfactory here and the optic. This big one here is the biggest of your cranial nerves, and that's the 5th nerve, or trigeminal. Okay, trigeminal, what does it mean? 3 roots. It's got an ophthalmic root, it's got a maxillary root, it's got a mandibular root. Basically, it's going to go to structures in the eye and the nasal cavity, it's going to go to the upper jaw in the teeth, it's going to go to the lower jaw in the teeth. It's responsible for the muscles of mastication, for chewing. Okay, it's the biggest of the cranial nerves. Okay, the one nerve that would be responsible if you went to the dentist and he anesthetized you, the nerve that he's knocking out, or she's knocking out, is the trigeminal, or some branch of the trigeminal. Okay, dentists are basically taught to go for the landmark. So they're going to go for either the mandibular foramen, they're going to go for the mental foramen. They don't want to hit the nerve, but they want to at least get somewhere around the nerve to sort of knock it out. Okay, and you can actually see the ophthalmic maxillary mandibular division here of your trigeminal nerve. Okay? So I just wanted to mention that to you. Any of the cranial nerves that I'd ask would be olfactory 1 or optic 2. So this is the brain, and we're going to go through the parts and some of the parts that I want you to know, okay, and talk a little bit about the areas. So these are the cerebral hemispheres, okay. It is the largest part of the brain, okay. It is also the most evolved part of the brain. It's what makes us distinguished from other animals. It is the neocortex, the actual outer part of the cerebrum. Okay? You can see in the cerebrum that it has grooves, or what we call sulci. Sulci is plural, sulcus is singular, and the actual convolutions, the actual mass between the grooves are your gyri, singular is gyrus. Okay? And that's your cerebrum. This is your cerebellum, your most posterior structures of the brain. It also has sulci and gyri. It's also got 2 hemispheres, a right and a left. Okay? You then have, usually in high school, junior high, and so on, they talk about the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata, or the medulla. Okay? This is the medulla here. But really, we're going to talk about the whole area here, which is the brain stem. Okay? And the brain stem starts with the midbrain here, up here. And then you have the pons, and then you have the medulla. And then, of course, that would lead into the spinal cord as it goes through the foramen magnum. Okay? So those are the parts that we're going to look at. Now, before I take this apart and show you the inside, there are certain landmarks on here. Okay? For instance, this here, that's separating the red from the blue, is the central sulcus. Okay, the central sulcus. So in front of it is the precentral gyrus. Remember, the sulcus is the groove, the mass of the brain, the convolution, is the gyrus. So if this is the central sulcus, in front of it, before it, is precentral gyrus, and behind it, the blue, is the postcentral gyrus. What it does is it separates one of the 2 primary lobes of the brain. Okay? The names of the lobes of the brain of the cerebrum are exactly the same as the bones of the skull. Okay? Frontal, parietal, occipital. This is the lateral sulcus that separates the frontal, parietal, and the temporal. Okay, so this is the Sylvian fissure, or the lateral fissure. This is the central sulcus, and this is the longitudinal fissure. Okay? So, the reason that they're colored differently is because it's telling you the distinction between the lobes. Okay, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. The 5th lobe of the cerebrum is underneath them on the inside. You can't see it from the surface. It's called the insula. Okay, the insula is very much involved with memory, as is the temporal lobe. So let's talk a little bit about this red area and this pink area. Okay, precentral, okay, gyrus. This is your main motor cortex. This is the main motor cortex. This is mapped out, every muscle in the body, and I don't know how far you got in lecture yet. You may have talked about the homunculus, okay, which is the distorted figure, cartoon figure of a human that sort of shows a really big hand, really big fingers, and a big voice box. Okay, that's because of the fact that those have the largest representations of nerve fibers going to it. Okay, if you looked at a similar type of cartoon figure, let's say, of a pig, probably their snout would be the highest, innervated, because they rely very heavily on the sense of smell. Okay, horses, dogs, cats, they're going to all have different innervations. What distinguishes humans is their ability to be ambidextrous, the opposable thumb. Okay, monkeys will have similar cartoon figures and innervations. But basically the hand and the fingers and the voice box, distinguish humans. Okay, and it's similar on both the motor and the sensory side. The torso is very small, the legs are very small, the hands and the fingers, and the voice box very large because of the amount of innervation. Okay, also realize that even though when we think muscle, we think movement, realize that all of your muscles have sensory innervation. They have innervation of the muscle spindles, they have innervation of the Golgi tendon organ. They are going to basically feel tension, muscle sense. Okay, you know exactly where your muscles are in space. Okay, it's not like you don't know where your foot or your leg or your head is. Okay, and that's because of the sensory innervation. Okay, the more sensory innervation a muscle has, the finer the movement. So the fingers have a lot of innervation. The hand has a lot of innervation. The voice box has a lot of innervation. Okay? The genitals will have a lot of sensory innervation. Okay? So, having said that, this is all mapped out. Okay? And what it does is, the reason we know that is from years of research and what each area is going to innervate. Okay? You may not realize it, but brain surgery, if you've ever seen it in movies or TV, you may realize that the patient is sometimes awake. Okay? The brain material itself, the brain tissue, feels no pain. It has no pain sensation going to it. So you can knock the patient out, go through the skull, and then actually wake the patient up and have them respond. There's some neurosurgery, you want the patient to respond so that you know what's going on. You don't want to knock out things that you don't want to knock out. So sometimes the neurosurgeon wants input from the patient. So this is your motor cortex on the precentral gyrus. The pink is an association area. Every major sensation has an association area with it. What it does is it fine-tunes what the main area is doing. So the premotor cortex fine-tunes the movement. Okay? In, let's say, the occipital region, which is for vision, the primary region gets all of the light and the, all the dots and the dashes and all the crude information, and the association visual area makes sense out of it. Okay? Either through memory or through other things. So every major sensation in the brain has an association area that fine-tunes and makes sense out of the information, interprets it, integrates it, whatever. Okay? On the left side of the brain, this premotor cortex is where your main speech area is, Broca's area. Okay? Broca's area is your main motor speech area, the larynx. So you've got motor activity going on here in the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex up here is about thought, civilized behavior, personality, ambitions and drives, things like that. It's really higher human, sensations and things like, or not sensations, but processes. I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of Phineas Gage. Okay, in lecture you probably hear about it. He worked on the railroads, and through an accident he got one of the railroad ties, went through his brain, and at first everything seemed okay. But then they realized that he started really acting out, cursing, and things like that, inappropriately, and stuff like that. That's because the prefrontal cortex, one of the things it deals with is civilized behavior. Okay, when they used to do prefrontal lobotomies, I don't know how many of you ever saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson. There was always the question as to whether or not they lobotomized him or not. What prefrontal lobotomies do is they actually sever the connections between the higher centers in the brain and the prefrontal cortex, so it renders them pretty much very calm, lethargic, and sort of out of it. Okay, they don't really do that anymore so much. I mean, that was popular in the 30s and the 40s, 50s. I don't think they do much lobotomizing anymore. They do go back to electric shock therapy nowadays, but lobotomy not so much. So those are the things that the frontal cortex will deal with. Something like language is very much sort of multifaceted. Because if you think about language, it's about understanding the language, it's about speaking the language, it's about hearing the language. It's all sorts of different things involved in speech and language. Okay, so it's multifaceted throughout the brain. It's not one distinct area necessarily. This blue area on the parietal lobe is the postcentral gyrus. It's about somatosensory, okay, which basically means sensory information to the soma, to the body. So we're talking about touch, pressure, temperature, hot and cold, pain, muscle sensation for muscle positioning, and joint sensation. For instance, you know where your muscles are. You know if you have a leg cramp or a cramp elsewhere in the muscle. That's somatosensory. Okay? Somatosensory is body sensations. And that's postcentral gyrus, the blue, parietal lobe. Touch, pressure, hot and cold, pain, muscle sensation. Occipital lobe, vision. Occipital lobe is vision. These are your visual cortexes. You get a blow to the back of your head, you're in an accident. They suspect a concussion. Besides the fact that they want to keep you up, that you don't fall asleep, okay, they're going to ask you, do you have blurred vision? Can you see? Okay, things that relate to vision, because this is about vision. Occipital lobe is visual. Temporal, the orange and yellow, hearing, auditory. So that pretty much takes care of all of the main sensations. Taste, smell, more inside the brain, okay, but the other ones pretty much the cortexes that I talked about. Occipital vision, temporal, hearing or audition, auditory, also memory, but you get memory in all of them. Okay, one of the interesting things, a somatosensory association cortex, okay, if you have a tumor or a lesion, if you have a stroke in that area, it will, remember, the right side of the body is handled by the left side of the brain and vice versa. Okay, but you get some pretty freaky type of effects if you have some kind of problem to the somatosensory association cortex. For instance, you could have a patient, it's almost like Alzheimer's. You could have a patient that knew how to get from home to work, but if they have a lesion in the somatosensory association cortex, they completely forget how to go where they're supposed to go. You could ask them to draw a picture, they would completely forget to draw half the picture. They would get dressed, forget the right side of their body to put on clothes, or on the left, depending where the lesion is. Okay? What it also does is, and especially it's closer to the memory area and whatnot, is that if I blindfolded you or closed your eyes, okay, and I put an object in your hand, you would be able to tell me what it was by feel, by sensation. Okay? If you have an injury to that association cortex, you wouldn't be able to do that. It would have to technically be something that you were familiar with, like if I put a key in your hand or a pencil or something that you have memory of, you would be able to feel it. Okay? So that's the cerebral cortex, which is the most evolved part of our brain. Cerebellum is about movement, balance and equilibrium, okay, and muscle coordination, velocity, force, things like that. Okay. Injury to the cerebellum, the effects will be very similar to if you were drunk or inebriated. So if you get stopped for drinking, I don't know if you'll get away with it, but if you get stopped for drinking, you could tell me you have a cerebellar disorder. I'm not sure it'll work, but okay. Basically, if you have a lesion to the cerebellum, you will have a problem touching your nose. You'll have a problem walking a straight line. Okay, the symptoms are very similar to being drunk. Okay? And then you have your brainstem, you have your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla. Okay, they are very much connected with the originations of your cranial nerves. Okay, and they are relay centers for information coming from the spinal cord up to the higher centers of the brain. Okay, and also going back in the other direction. Processed information going back out to the peripheral structures, to the spinal cord. Okay? Okay, and they're very much relay centers and things like that. If you have neural problems, strokes, tumors in these areas, you could knock out different types of functions. For instance, the pons is very much involved with respiration. Okay? The medulla is involved with heart, rate, it's involved with blood pressure, it's involved with respiration. You've got cough reflexes and vomiting reflexes in the medulla, a lot of vital centers. So you've got a lot going on in the brainstem. Now, these two white dots here are referred to as the mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies are somehow involved with like the hypothalamus in that area of the brain. Okay. So in here, I didn't bring in the ventricle models, but that's okay. This is your first ventricle. Okay, these are the first and second ventricles here. Okay. When you look at it in here, here's your first ventricle, more or less. Okay, and if you come down, you'll have your third ventricles, and then down here you'll have your aqueduct down into your fourth ventricle down here. Okay, because here's the midbrain, here's the brain stem. Okay, you have the midbrain, mesencephalon. You have your pons, medulla, cerebellum. This is the fourth ventricle here, between the pons and the cerebellum. Okay, now this here, corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, that's what this is. This is the corpus callosum. This is actually the fornax, which is part of the limbic system, which is your emotional brain. Okay, we're not going to go into that. Limbic system is fornax, it's cingulate gyrus, it's amygdala, hippocampus, okay, all about emotions. Okay, this is the corpus callosum. Anyone know what it is? Well, basically the two cerebral hemispheres communicate with each other. Okay, and the corpus callosum is basically your commissural fibers that communicate what's going on the right side with the left brain and the left brain with the right brain. Okay? Now, Disney did a movie about a kid that had epilepsy years and years ago. Huh?
Is that what they call when they give you a lobotomy?
No. Lobotomy is basically severing prefrontal cortex here. This is the prefrontal cortex with other areas of the brain. So you lose civilized behavior. Corpus callosum is going to connect the information from the right to the left cerebrum. Is it the end of the world? No, technically, unless you were trained, you wouldn't probably be able to tell the difference. Okay, the kid had severe epilepsy that could not be handled with drugs, and epilepsy is about bad firing of neurons, okay, inappropriate firing of neurons. So if you go in and cut the corpus callosum, it basically can sort of calm the patient down in terms of the firing inappropriately. Okay, so that's the corpus callosum. Below the cerebral hemispheres, basically you have your diencephalon. Okay, diencephalon is the thalamus, these things, which is very much a relay center for information going up to the brain and back down to the spinal cord. Now, this purple structure here, choroid plexus. Okay. Anyone know what the choroid plexus does? Choroid plexus produces cerebrospinal fluid, which bathes the brain and the spinal cord. What it does is it actually is going to, each one of these areas, each one of these ventricles is going to have this here in blue is a choroid plexus. What happens is it produces cerebrospinal fluid, it then sends it down, and it lets it pass all the way down from the first two to the third to the fourth, and then it passes down the central canal of the spinal cord, okay, and around the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord in the brain. And what it does is it bathes the brain. Okay, and then remember what happens is that all that cerebrospinal fluid has to drain back somewhere. And it will drain back eventually into these blue structures. These are your venous sinuses, which we saw last week, the dural sinuses, okay, here. The falx cerebri, your dural sinuses in the middle, okay, tentorium cerebelli, Okay, and then the one that comes down would be in here, is the falx cerebelli between the lobes of the cerebellum. Okay, falx cerebri is between the lobes of the cerebrum. Tentorium cerebelli between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and the falx cerebelli between the lobes of the cerebellum. Okay, and your dural sinuses are in there. So they drain the venous blood, and they actually go into structures like this. These are called arachnoid granulations. Okay, and the arachnoid granulations would eventually drain the cerebrospinal fluid back into the venous blood, and it would go through back into the venous system and down into the heart. Okay, so that's your choroid plexus. This pink structure here, pineal gland, okay, or pineal gland. Okay, so here you have the pituitary gland. Okay, and then you have the infundibulum, which actually connects the pituitary with the hypothalamus. This is hypothalamus. This is pineal gland. Now, pineal or pineal gland, anyone know what it does? Produces melatonin. Okay, melatonin is basically believed to be involved with sleep, circadian rhythms, biorhythms, sleep-wake cycles, things like that. It's very much related. It comes from tryptophan, okay, which also serotonin is derived from. Okay, it's one of those neurotransmitters that's derived from amino acids. Okay, and serotonin is your main neurotransmitter for sleep. Okay, if you go for surgery, general anesthesia, where they knock you out, okay, basically they're knocking out the area that would produce serotonin. So you're basically rendered unconscious. Okay, so this big thing here is the thalamus. Okay, they call this like the seahorse. Looks like a seahorse, the head and the tail. Okay, again, you have the midbrain, you have the pons and the medulla. Okay, I showed you the choroid plexus and the pineal gland. These four bumps here on the midbrain, corpora quadrigemina. Can't wait to see the spelling on the test. Corpora quadrigemina, okay, and it's got the bumps here. Okay, the two on the top are your superior colliculi, and the two on the bottom are your inferior colliculi. Okay, what they're about is auditory and visual reflexes. So any blinking, okay, any visual reflex, any hearing reflex is going to be processed in these areas. Okay. These here are the midbrain. These are your cerebral peduncles. Okay, if you take it apart, you can see here again the pineal gland. Okay, you can see the hypothalamus, the optic chiasm, mammillary bodies down here. So those are the main parts of the brain that I want you to